I'm going to kind of get straight into the next panel that I organized. So I will start off by talking about my work as a librarian managing the Cassady collection, and then I will hand over to my colleagues from USC Libraries who just appeared on the screen. Doub is our accessioning archivist, who accessions all of the archival and ephemeral material in the Cassady collection. And then Joshua Hutchinson is our head of cataloging and acquisitions, and we'll talk about cataloging issues and examples from the Cassady collection. So just to give the background, I started working with the Cassady collection only last July in the formal capacity of being the librarian responsible for it. As Hugh had said in the introduction earlier, my primary role is Japanese Studies Librarian. But when I started at USC in that role back in 2016, I was really interested to find out that we actually have a significant number of Japanese materials in the Cassady collection. And some of you are already familiar with this. You got really great insight from Michelle's presentation about, the reason for that is the popularity of Alice in Japan. We have more translations into Japanese than in any other language, and so on. So that was kind of my avenue into looking at the Cassady collection initially. And then last July, when the position to be the librarian responsible for the collection in its entirety was vacant, the dean asked me to take that over. So one of the first things I did, as I'm just going to start sharing my screen, was think about this idea of Alice in Japan, because that's clearly then for me connecting the two like intersections and interests. So we're trying to hold a conference at USC that I've been planning for a couple of years now, Encountering Alice in Japan. It was initially planned previously, and then we had to postpone due to COVID, but we're hoping to get that up and running again for next year. Some of the things you've heard about today, like Gothic Lolita fashion and identity, intersection between video games and literature. Samir from USC Libraries mentioned earlier today, video games and AI. There's also a lot of Alice influence in video games, and just the general theme of representation of girlhood in Japanese literature and popular culture. So this is something to hopefully look out for some of you that will have this conference coming up next year. Another one of the things that I really got started with early on in thinking about the Cassady collection and how I can approach it as a librarian. Oh, great. People are already saying they want to attend. So that's good. Was looking at the Japanese components of the collection and just trying to get more information known about it. So for me, thinking about people in the Lewis Carroll Society, for example, you're really familiar with the world and you know about things like the Cassady collection, where to go for that kind of research. But in the Japanese studies community, most people are tapped into their East Asian library and their Japanese collections and not aware of resources that are outside of that kind of specific context. So I wanted to draw attention to the fact that we actually have a great number of materials that are relevant for the study of Japanese literature and culture at USC Libraries that are not in the East Asian Library, but are in special collections, in this case within the Cassady collection. So together with Jessie Dryan, who is working with me as an assistant, we wrote an article for the North American Coordinating Council on Japanese Library Resources to highlight the Japanese materials within the Cassady collection and kind of describe like our journey through it and explain to people some of the types of materials they could find in the Cassady collection and how they can be used for research. Maybe research on Japanese popular culture, for example, not necessarily Carroll related research specifically, or research on literary history and translation history. So for example, Michelle mentioned earlier the 1899 first translation of Carroll's works into Japanese, which we have in the collection. I also started thinking about, what can I do as the librarian thinking about helping students? We heard yesterday from a lot of students who entered the Wonderland Awards at USC Libraries, this annual competition for new creative works created by students inspired by the collection. I had an intern from our Masters of Management and Library Information Sciences program at USC, Chrissa Stewart, who worked with me last semester. And so we looked at the research guide for the Cassady collection, and a research guide on the library's website is really the first place that students are directed to go to when they have questions or want to start their research. It's not intended to be comprehensive. It's just kind of like, here's some ideas to get you started. And so we basically spent a couple of months updating the research guide and thinking about what would be most useful. Of course, we still have the links to the wonderful Cassady collection bibliography that George Cassady maintains. And under this Getting Started tab, we wanted to give students an idea of the fact that, of course, there's the books in the collection, and there's many, many books, and you can look at all different styles of illustration. You can just pick your favorite. You can look at like a range of different examples of illustrations to inspire you. And that we also have a lot of objects and ephemera, dolls. We have manga. We have these more like contemporary pieces. We have artworks. I have to say, if any of you are familiar with the LibGuide software that we use for this, it's actually really hard to embed images in it. And Chris has spent a long time doing that because it's such a visually rich collection. We wanted students to be inspired and to get a sense of what they might find when they dive deeper. We also added this feature, what to read after the Alice books, because for a lot of people, they might have read Alice as a child, and then now they're at university and they're thinking, well, why does the university library have this collection of children's literature? Or what else can I learn? How can I maybe put my reading of Alice into a more academic context? So that's where we, for example, mentioning the wonderful annotated Alice, and then, alerting people to the fact that there are other Carroll works aside from the Alice books, although that, they tend to be the starting point for many people. Also giving examples of some of the reference works that we have, some of the many, many academic articles on Carroll and Dodgson that are available through the databases that the USC Libraries subscribes to as well. So if anyone has feedback on any of this, I'd love to hear from you. But it was really an attempt to rethink like what the starting point for a lot of our students might be with such a big collection that can kind of be overwhelming when you first look at it, if you're not expecting to find over 5,000 items related to Lewis Carroll, and you're looking for that like starting point for your own journey and inspiration. Another thing I wanted to mention, I think I have to stop sharing and then reshare to switch to a different, object, is that one of my roles as the librarian is to think about managing the collection. So I created new collection development and management guidelines for the Cassady Lewis Carroll Collection at USC because we didn't actually have any in place before, even though this is a collection that we've now been building in partnership with the donors for almost 2 decades. But institutions change, leadership changes, personnel changes. I'm not the first librarian to work with the collection. I won't be the last. So it's important to have documentation written down about how we deal with what is a really unique collection in so many respects. So part of it is just documenting the things that we already do, but putting them down on paper. My colleague Josh will talk more about this later, but even basic things around the cataloging, that every item that is donated comes with the local cataloging notes included to make it part of the collection, a gift note with the year of donation, so tracing that collection history, and then the bibliographic details of importance, the edition, the version, etc. Most of these are provided by Dr. Cassady already. He gives us so much information and research behind the materials that he donates. And I also wanted to mention for any other collectors out there thinking about their materials and where they might be housed in the future, that we also welcome donations from others to add to the Cassady collection, and that information from that it's from a specific donor is again added to the local note. And we're also keeping a record of the collection history as well, because I think that's a really important part of a collection like this as well for researchers in the future. And then just in terms of future plans, my assistant Jessie is working, for example, on the Japanese materials in our collection and trying to assign reading levels to them so they can be used in Japanese language classes. So what I mean by that is Japanese has phonetic script, hiragana and katakana, and then it has Chinese characters. And when people are at beginning levels of reading ability, the Chinese characters are often glossed with the phonetic script. And then as you acquire more fluency in Chinese characters, the phonetic glossing starts to disappear. And so in our language classes at USC for Japanese, students practice reading at different levels. And we are thinking that we can use the Japanese materials in the Cassady collection in those language classes once we've managed to pair up the different reading levels with the levels of ability of students in those classes. And we are in discussion at USC Libraries at the moment, myself and a number of colleagues, including Hugh and Anne-Marie, who some of you have met through yesterday and today, with the Bellevue Arts Museum in Washington. And we'll be hosting next summer an exhibition, or they'll be hosting at the Bellevue Arts Museum an exhibition that is primarily drawing from the Cassady collection. It's tentatively titled Designing Alice, and we'll look at the design history of Alice, some of the great things we've all been talking about today. So that's something else to look out for. And then finally, I think some of you have already noticed the big announcement online. I'm really excited to let you know that we have announced a new Carolian Fellowship at USC Libraries. So this will be a one-year appointment with a $20,000 stipend, and we're looking for someone whose work will be enhanced by association with USC Libraries and the Cassady collection in particular, and someone whose work embodies the polymathic spirit of Charles Dodgson. So not necessarily someone who's doing research on Lewis Carroll or those works specifically that he created, but more broadly this idea of the polymathic spirit. And we're welcoming applications until May 31st. And we are open to remote or hybrid possibilities, maybe combined with in-person residence periods in LA. So I hope some of you will consider that for your own research and circulate that announcement through your networks. I'd now like to hand over to Bo, who's going to talk to us about the archival materials in the Cassady collection and the work he's been doing to enhance the finding aid.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bo Doub. I am the Accessioning Archivist at USC Libraries, as Rebecca said. I decided to come to campus today, which was kind of a mistake, the LA Times Book Fair. Busy day. So let me share my screen. Make sure to share the right one. Okay. So I recently finished accessioning and processing the archival materials that the Cassadys acquired for the Lewis Carroll Collection during 2021. And while the Cassady Lewis Carroll Collection has always included material that would traditionally be considered archival, this year we made some changes in how we process and describe the archival material in the collection. And by archival material here, I'm talking about primary source materials that researchers typically find in archival collections, such as correspondence, photographs, visual materials, ephemera, three-dimensional artifacts, and lots of other formats. So today I'm going to introduce some key concepts in archival processing and description, and then I'm going to explore those concepts in the context of the Cassady Lewis Carroll Collection. Okay. So before we get into the Cassady collection, let's briefly review a few important archival terms. The first three terms on this slide all relate to the importance of preserving the previous state of the archival collection. And preservation in this context goes beyond physically preserving each item individually. Preservation in this context kind of gets into the preservation of the relationships between items in a collection. So those relationships between items could be the categories that the collection's creator used to organize items in the collection, the physical arrangement of items in the collection, or the context in which certain items were created or held previously. So for an example of context, if the donor or creator of an archival collection previously held some of their papers in their workplace office and other papers in their home, that information would be useful to preserve and convey in the collection's description, if that distinction between workplace office and home still existed. The next definition, finding aid, is useful for getting a sense of the scale that archival description can take. So one way that archival description differs from monographic cataloging, which Josh is going to be talking about, is that archival description can be applied at a lot of different levels. So a single record in a finding aid could describe a single photograph in the collection, or a whole box of correspondence, or even a series of boxes relating to a specific topic. Though almost all of the material described in the Cassady Lewis Carroll finding aid is described at a relatively detailed level, because the collectors and donors of the collection, the Cassadys, provide a lot of detail about each of their acquisitions, which we're able to reuse in both the catalog records and the finding aid. So thank you, George and Linda, for making my life easier. The last term that I'm including on this slide is accession, which can be a noun or a verb. So the Cassadys donated all of the Lewis Carroll related material that they acquired during 2021 at one time. So all of that material constitutes one accession, and that accession is being added to an existing collection, the Cassady Lewis Carroll Collection, which is made up of other accessions from the same source. And the verb form of accession is part of my job title at USC, Accessioning Archivist. So I'm usually one of the first people to see a new archival acquisition when it gets to USC, before it can be accessed by scholars or processed further. And the intellectual versus physical distinction in the accession definition is kind of a common theme in archival terminology. I'll get into intellectual versus physical control a little bit later in the presentation. Okay, so back to the Cassady Lewis Carroll Collection. So over the last 20 years or so, the USC libraries have experimented with various approaches in processing, describing, and providing access to archival materials in the Cassady collection. In the past, the descriptive records for almost all of the archival items in the Cassady collection were created using standards and processes typically used in the cataloging of rare books. So it's essentially each item in the collection, regardless of format, was cataloged with an item level record in the USC Libraries integrated library system. So like the main catalog search on the USC Libraries website. And you can see an example catalog record on the left part of the slide for a deck of Alice in Wonderland playing cards from Japan. And this item level record shown on the left describes a type of format that you would more often find described as part of an archival collection, rather than cataloged individually like it is here. And while you can see the Cassady Lewis Carroll Collection title in this record's local note field and George Cassady's name in the acquisition source field, those are really the only clues to the end user linking this item to others in the Cassady collection. So then on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see a record for a similar type of item that I described in the archival finding aid for the Cassady Lewis Carroll collection. So the finding aid has a collection level record with dates, controlled Library of Congress subject headings, creator names, and other notes that describe the collection as a whole. But the finding aid also has these more detailed subrecords that are organized into series and subseries. So as you can see in the screenshot on the right, the description for this deck of tarot cards is first nested under a series titled Ephemera and Realia in the finding aid. And then it is categorized further under two subseries, one for Realia and then more specifically for playing cards. And if we wanted to get even more detailed, we could make this deck of tarot cards its own subseries with a subrecord underneath that for each card in the deck. But we're not going to go that far here. In this case, we just have one record for the deck of tarot cards with more description about each card in the record's scope and contents note. And you can see part of the record on the screenshot, but that's not the whole record. So both of these systems, the catalog record and the finding aid, each have their own strengths and weaknesses in describing and providing access to different parts of the Cassady collection. I'm going to talk about the finding aid side, and then Josh is going to talk about the catalog record side. So let's go on an adventure. Click this link here so I can show you the full record in the finding aid. Oh, and let me stop sharing really quick so I can switch windows. Okay. Okay. So this is the subrecord for that deck of tarot cards that I screenshotted on the previous slide. This is yeah, all of this information on the left all relates to this deck of tarot cards. So you can see the scope and contents note with each card listed. You can see the dates, the creator of the tarot cards, the language, the format type, a few more creators down here. And you can see that these cards are stored in box 8 in the collection, in the Cassady Lewis Carroll Collection. Then let's scroll up a little bit. I'll ask you to kind of focus on this collection organization part of the finding aid on the right. So you can see we're here in these tarot cards. As I scroll up, you can see some of the different series and subseries that categorize all the different items that are described in this finding aid. So I'm going to click on this top record here, which is the collection level record. So this record describes, kind of summarizes the collection as a whole, and it doesn't get into like more specific subrecords. So you can see a scope and contents note for the entire collection. We'll come back to these links that go to other resources in a minute. You can see the dates, the inclusive dates for everything in the collection. This is just one creator. There are more listed down farther in the finding aid. You can see all of the languages represented in the collection, the extent of the collection, basically its size. And one note about this collection level information, this information only covers the material that's currently described in the finding aid. We're kind of experimenting at the libraries right now with a few options to eventually migrate or copy all of the information from the item level catalog records for archival items, like the Japanese deck of playing cards from the last slide that were kind of cataloged like more like rare books. So we're kind of experimenting with options to like migrate or copy that information into this finding aid. So once that happens, this extent and all of these languages will be a lot more extensive because it will cover a lot more of the Cassady Lewis Carroll collection. Okay, so scrolling down more, we'll come back to this arrangement note back in the PowerPoint in a minute. This is from the Cassady Lewis Carroll bibliography that Rebecca mentioned earlier. This related materials note gets into some related finding aids and the material that's been cataloged separately via the library's main catalog search. Here are some subject headings from the Library of Congress that link to other subject headings in our instance of archive space. Archive space is the system that we use to create and publish these finding aids. More creators that are kind of representative of a lot of material in the collection. There are more specific creator names on the subrecords though. Some source information, and then these two links to external resources outside of the finding aid are what those were displaying at the top of the finding aid, which I kind of skipped over earlier. The first link under digital material is the link to the collection bibliography, authored and maintained by George Cassady. And as Rebecca was saying earlier, the Cassady bibliography is kind of the most comprehensive inventory of everything in the Cassady collection, including both published materials available through the main catalog search and most of the archival materials described in this finding aid. And I'll revisit the bibliography when we get back to the PowerPoint. And the second link under here leads users to the USC Digital Library, where users can look at material from the Cassady Lewis Carroll Collection that's been digitized. But only a fraction of the collection has been digitized. So users aren't looking at everything in the collection when they're browsing the digital library. Okay, so let's jump back to the PowerPoint now. All right. So a bit more about the Cassady bibliography. As I mentioned earlier, preserving the original order of an archival collection is often important for preserving the structure and context of the material as it was created or accumulated before it was deemed like an archival collection at USC. So one way we did this with the Cassady Lewis Carroll finding aid was by incorporating many of the elements from the Cassady collection bibliography into the finding aid. So as you can see on this slide, George wrote a very helpful and very Carrollian introduction to the bibliography that explains some of the bibliography's policies on categorizing collection material. And George was being a good archivist here because one of the standard collection level notes that archivists include in finding aids is the arrangement note, which kind of serves the same purpose as this introduction. So the original order, quote unquote, of archival collections, which archivists strive to preserve, often involve very idiosyncratic filing systems that were originally established by the collector's creator or the previous owner. So the arrangement note is often useful for describing these filing systems to researchers, kind of to aid them in navigating the finding aid. So don't worry, George, if you're here, the inconsistencies and subjective policies that you kind of confess to in its introduction are not unique to the Cassady collection. I have seen much worse in many of the collections of personal papers that I've processed. I won't go into the personal papers of retired USC faculty that I've seen. It gets messy. The important thing is to be transparent about these decisions by documenting them in places like the finding aid, and in this case, the bibliography. Okay, and one of the great things about archival finding aids and the systems that we use to create them is that finding aids are designed to reflect these kinds of sets and subsets visually. So on the left of this slide, you can see an excerpt from the Cassady bibliography's list of sets, which we call series in a finding aid. So each set listing includes a brief note about the arrangement of that set, so how it's organized. So in the case of set 16, art, items are listed in the bibliography first by format and then by date. And the screenshot below that is from the part of the bibliography listing specific items under set 16, so the series for art. and the two pictured items, which are both film celluloids from the Disney film, are listed together with other film cells in the collection. So all of those are kind of listed together by format and then by date. So yeah, I'm not going to badmouth the bibliography because I would honestly be lost without it. Again, it's the one place where everything in the Cassady collection is listed in the same place. That is invaluable. However, because of the sheer size of the bibliography, it can be difficult at times for users to navigate its various sets and subsets, especially because everything is listed together in one document without any kind of like visual hierarchies. So navigating the bibliography often requires a lot of Control F searching and scrolling because of the size and format of the document, as all of us kind of power users of the Cassady collection know. The finding aid, on the other hand, is built for these types of hierarchical groupings. So you can see in the screenshot of the finding aid on the right that we were able to replicate the art set's kind of multi-level filing scheme using these visually nested descriptive records. So if a user knows they want to find something under the art set, they can scroll past the previous sets and then kind of selectively expand or collapse the series and subseries that they are interested in, which it's not really possible in the bibliography. So that's one strength of the finding aid. Okay, so one of the last things I'm going to talk about today is how the storage and retrieval of cataloged books differs from the storage and retrieval of archival material. So in the image on the left, you can see a few of the cataloged rare books from the Cassady Lewis Carroll Collection as they're arranged in the Special Collections reading room in Doheny Library. And as you can see from each book's tag peeking out at the top, these books were cataloged and shelved by their Library of Congress call numbers, which we're all kind of used to and familiar with. So as many of you know, shelving the books this way enables users to browse books that are related by time or place or subject together in one place. And when we retrieve books under the system, we look at all of the books on the shelf in sequence, kind of scanning through the call numbers until we arrive at the one we're looking for. Archival storage and retrieval, on the other hand, is a little bit different because archival material involves a lot of different sizes and formats that often cannot be stored together. And also archival material is almost always stored in areas that are not open to the public. So shelving with browsability in mind is not as much of an issue. So the screenshots on the right side of this slide show two different parts of the staff kind of backend interface of ArchivesSpace, which I mentioned before is the system that we use to manage finding aids and archival description at USC. And you can see here that we kind of store and retrieve archival material by container, like box or oversized folder, not by individual title or item level call number like we do for cataloged books. And you can see a few item level records in the lower right screenshot showing that material can be grouped together in the finding aid while also being physically stored in separate containers and locations. And archivists described that distinction as physical control versus intellectual control, which I mentioned earlier when we were discussing the key archival concepts. Intellectual control is like, what is in the collection? Is it relevant to certain research? Physical control is like, where is this box? How do we retrieve it when it's requested? Similarly, archival containers described under the same collection do not necessarily need to be stored together in sequence. So you don't need to see like box 1, box 2, box 3 all in the same area of the stacks. You can see that the box and oversized folder locations in the screenshot on the upper right-hand side of the slide are stored in completely different floors and rooms of Doheny Library because of the different types of storage available in those rooms. So what I was emphasizing earlier about archival description existing in relation to each other as part of like an aggregate record is kind of flipped when we're talking about archival storage and retrieval, because with archival storage, each container kind of exists independently with its own shelving coordinates, regardless of the other related containers for the same collection. Whereas books are kind of stored and retrieved in relation to each other as part of a sequence, even though they're cataloged separately. Okay, last slide before I hand it over to Josh. I wanted to quickly show, I'm realizing this illustration is getting a lot of a lot of screen time this weekend. So I wanted to quickly show where we publish this archival description after creating the finding aid in archive space. As you can see, the description that we create in archive space kind of travels through various data formats and systems in order to make the collection discoverable in a lot of different places. So Josh is more familiar with the MARC standard because that's the language that catalogers speak. And the MARC form of the description is what we publish in WorldCat and the USC's kind of main catalog search. But most archivists get more excited about encoded archival description, or EAD, because of its ability to represent hierarchical relationships and multi-level description. So like all of those sub-records that were underneath the collection level record in the finding aid. And the EAD form of the finding aid, which is like the fullest form of the finding aid, is what we publish in archive space and to the Online Archive of California, which if you're not familiar with the OAC, it's a great resource for exploring a lot of different archival finding aids from institutions across California. And the USC Digital Library is there because I often collaborate with colleagues in the digital library when certain material gets digitized from collections that I worked with, and we kind of like reuse and link our descriptions across our separate systems. And that's it for me. I'll stop sharing and hand it over to Josh, and I'm happy to take questions after Josh is done.
Great. Thanks, Bo. I'll share my screen now. Can everyone see that, hear me? Everything is good? Great. Okay, so I really appreciate hearing that from Bo, because Bo and I obviously do the same things. We both describe library resources. We work in the same department at the library, but we do it in such different ways and with such different ways of thinking about the materials we're working with, that I think it's really fascinating to hear how he's thinking about what he's working with and to see the structured description that archival description allows. That's really excellent. Okay, so my name's Josh Hutchinson. I'm head of cataloging and acquisitions at the USC Libraries. I wanted to talk today about some of the books in the Cassady collection and think a little bit about the benefits and trade-offs of using what I'm going to call bibliographic description. So describing each individual item in the library catalog, in the traditional library catalog. So this is what we would normally do with books, traditional books. I'm going to try and keep in mind the fundamental question that whenever I'm training catalogers or whenever I'm cataloging a book myself, I try and think about what am I actually cataloging here? And I'm going to try and ask that question throughout this presentation because it's an important question to ask consistently. Sometimes it's an easy question to answer. Sometimes it's simply, I'm cataloging the 1886 Appleton edition. Very simple. I'm cataloging DVD of the 1951 cartoon. It's a very simple thing to ask sometimes, but sometimes the answer is a lot more complicated. And the Cassady collection gives us a lot of those complicated examples, and that's what catalogers live for. So I'm going to do a quick tour through the library catalog, mostly looking at some snarks, some foreign language, colorful, and somewhat similar snarks, and then one or two non-snark examples. I'm going to start though with a dog from a different library catalog. So, as I say, the first question the catalogers ask themselves is, what am I looking at here? What am I actually cataloging? Throughout the library, though, people are asking that same question, right? So Bo has just talked to us about how he's asking that question. What am I archiving? And Rebecca's also talked to us about how she asks that question. What am I actually curating here? What is the collection? And how am I thinking about this collection holistically? And we're also always asking, how are patrons finding this thing? How are patrons accessing it? How are they discovering what we're putting in the library and what we're putting in the library collections? So I think all of this is sort of feeding into the same questions that we're all asking each ourselves and thinking about how we're describing things in the library. As I said, sometimes these are easy questions to answer. Sometimes it's more of a dialogue. Sometimes Bo and I ask each other, how should we deal with this? Do you think I should deal with this? Do you think you should deal with it? Sometimes it's a very simple, I think I should catalog it. He thinks I should archive it. And sometimes it's, I think you should archive it. Sometimes I think you should put it in an archival collection. And he tells me, no, I think you should catalog this individually. And that's fine. We have to talk about these things sometimes because there are complicated answers to complicated questions. So most of what we put in the library catalog is really simple. It's very straightforward, but sometimes it isn't. So I'm just going to briefly look at Cooper the therapy dog. He's a dog in the Harvard Medical School library. They cataloged him. He's in their library catalog. I think the example of Cooper the therapy dog is an excellent example of two things. It's demonstrating, one, that library catalogers have some sort of sense of humor. They put things in the library catalog and describe them in minute detail about what this is. And it's not a book, right? This is a dog. But also that anything can be cataloged. And that's why I use this. I could catalog the chair I'm sitting on. I could catalog that light behind me. It's not necessarily a good idea to do that, but almost anything can be in the library catalog. So here the answer to my question there is, what am I cataloging? It's a 15-pound Shih Tzu named Cooper. That's fine. He's in the library. Well, as I say, I use him a lot for my cataloging trainings and things. I looked him up earlier this week and I saw, oh, actually he's missing, and he's been missing since 2017. So I hope he's okay, but that's what we're cataloging. He's in the library catalog. And that catalog record served a clear purpose. It meant that Cooper was discoverable, so library patrons could search for him, and he was retrievable. They could request him and check him out for therapy, and sort of, I think he was there for like cuddling and relaxation during finals week and that sort of thing. Okay, so let's think about what we know to be in the library catalog, books. And I think subsidiary questions that I want to be thinking about through the rest of this talk is, why do we use the library catalog and what are the benefits? So we can do very specific searches in the library catalog and we can find exactly what it is we're looking for. So here I've just done a very basic search for Hunting with the Snark, and that comes up with a bunch of different books. In fact, it yields about just over 100 books in the library in the USC catalog. The first result when I did my search earlier this week was this book, The Complete Stories of Lewis Carroll, published in 1993 by Magpie. So the reason I thought I'll put this example up on this slide is because I did a title search for Hunting with the Snark, but what actually came up is not a book titled The Hunting with the Snark. It's The Complete Stories of Lewis Carroll. That's the title of this book. If you showed it to someone and said, what am I putting in the catalog? They'll say, it's The Complete Stories of Lewis Carroll. So we need to look at the detailed display in the catalog to understand exactly why the Hunting with the Snark search resulted in this book. So in the middle of my screen here, there's a detailed display from the library catalog, and we can see a contents note which names the Hunting with the Snark as one of the titles within the book. And then right at the bottom of my display here, I've got what's called the MARC record display, which is the behind the scenes, the back end of the library catalog. And it shows that that contents note comes from a field which is coded with 8 titles. I just have to check my notes, that's 8 titles. So this book will come up for 9 different searches, The Complete Stories of Lewis Carroll, and 8 separate individual title searches. So we need to ask ourselves a question, again, what are we cataloging here? And the answer is not necessarily going to be the same as for patrons. What am I looking for here? Because what we're cataloging here is The Complete Stories of Lewis Carroll. A patron might just be looking for Sylvie and Bruno Concluded or Hunting with the Snark. And we need to accommodate that based on what the book is. So, okay. So I regret following Michelle's talk earlier that I didn't put an example of the Japanese translations here, but these are just a couple of screenshots of different translations of Hunting of the Snark, all of which are identified as such in the library catalog because each is recorded as a translation in the catalog record. So you can see that there is the title and there's also the uniform title. So at the top, Hunting of the Snark Hebrew, French, Swedish, and Russian. And you can see that that uniform title serves to co-locate all versions of this book, even if they're called something else. Again, if you showed this book, and I'll just use the French one because that's more pronounceable for me. If you showed this book to someone and said, what am I cataloging here? They would say La Chasse au Snark, which is fine, but most people would search for library catalog at USC for Hunting of the Snark. So we have to make sure that this comes up for that. So what this means is that when you search the title, the library catalog for a book titled Hunting of Snark, you'll see all of these translations. The way the catalog is set up, therefore, it makes the answer to the question, what am I cataloging here, very structured. In this case, what we're cataloging is Hunting of the Snark in French, as well as La Chasse au Snark, because that allows better access to this book. Okay. I think we've all used library catalogs in this way, so I don't think I'm saying anything new. I just want to be clear about how this is presented in the library catalog and how we get to the next parts. Okay. So up until now, I've shown screenshots from library catalog because I'm mainly interested in what makes library catalog records look similar. But here's a photo of 3 editions of Hunting of the Snark. All of them are published by the Cheshire Cat Press, all of them are hardbound, all of them are issued in slipcases. They all actually look really similar. If you showed them to someone and said, what's the difference between these 3 books? There's not a whole lot of difference. The title is the same, author is the same, the publisher is the same, the publication date is almost the same for all of them. The main difference here is that they're actually different colors. One is dark blue, one's light gray, and one is maroon. But they also actually have different illustrators, introductions from different people, and also different accompanying material. There are other differences between these volumes. So one of them has 12 illustrations by Byron Sewell with an introduction by Edward Wakeling. The other one has 13 cartes de visite by Andy Malcolm. And another one has 13 wood engravings by George Walker. So they're each actually different interpretations and different editions of this story, but they're published by the same press and they are published to make themselves look a little bit similar. So here is the behind the scenes. Again, this is the marked display of some of the notes for one of these records. This is the maroon one, which I think has the, I think this one's for woodcuts, not sure. And it includes a print of a map in the front pocket. So in this case, the cataloger's question needs to be a lot more specific. It's not just, what am I cataloging here? Because the answer to that would be the same for each of these 3 books. It needs to be really detailed in order to distinguish this is the pale blue one, from the other 2. So there's a lot that we can put in the catalog records in order to help distinguish one edition of this book from another. These are just some of the notes we have in one of the records for one of those books. It helps to identify the difference between those 3 apparently similar volumes. And you'll note that some of these notes apply to all of the 42 copies of this book that were produced by Cheshire Cat Press, and some of them only apply specifically to the USC copy. So for instance, we can see in this note that's called a 541 note, this is what Rebecca referred to about the note referring to the gift from Dr. George Cassady in 2020. And that note there's CLSU, that's our local USC code. And then also those last 2 lines, the collection note, and then this is copy number 16, those apply simply uniquely to the USC copy. So at this point, the cataloger is asking, what am I cataloging here, and what makes it different from what any other cataloger is cataloging? So if someone else had this pale blue calico grain cloth covered cardboard slipcase edition of it, how is our USC copy different from that? We've also obviously asked, how is our pale blue calico grain cloth covered cardboard slipcase edition different from the maroon and the dark blue one? Okay. So this is another edition, obviously, of Hunting of the Snark. This is a really lovely edition. It was published in, this is not an advertisement for Office Depot, but it's just less than 13 centimeters, so it's quite small. It was published in Kettering in England by J.L. Carr at his Quince Tree Press. He published many of these small books. I think it was over 100 of them. And one of them was this, The Hunting of the Snark. So it's interesting, we're not quite sure when this was published. I think it was probably sometime in the 80s, but we're not entirely sure. But he used his press to publish local maps. So he created maps of the local area. A number of these small books, as I mentioned, his own novels, he was a novelist, and many of these small books had multiple printings, and he was able to distinguish those printings because sometimes he changed the color of the paper that he was printing them on, the color of the cover. Okay. So when we were cataloging this book, we decided that the publisher, which is J.L. Carr and his Quince Tree Press, were worth spending some time on. One thing that we did while cataloging this was to create an authority record in the Library of Congress's name authority file for the Quince Tree Press. Much like Lewis's Carroll authority record, which allows people to search the catalog for Charles Dodson and find books by Lewis Carroll, this ensures that anyone cataloging books published by the Quince Tree Press will do so using the same heading, and they're very easy to find and view together. In this case, we've determined that what we're cataloging here is as much a book published by J.L. Carr's Quince Tree Press as it is a book written by Lewis Carroll. Those two things are both important here. This is a book that's distinguished by the publication as well as by the content of the book. That's part of why it's in this collection, why we have it in the library. The catalog record now has what's called access points for both Carroll and for Carr and his Quince Tree Press, because we've determined that the publisher is an important contributor to the way this book appears. And I want to highlight here that this book is small enough but only one hand and wrist need suffer exposure when you're reading this in bed in a cold room. I thought that was great. And I can imagine that book, or this house in Kettering, would actually have quite a few cold rooms. Okay. Let's think about what we know to be in the library catalog. Books. Why do we use the library catalog? What are its benefits? So Bo and I really speak different languages. It's interesting to hear him talk about how he describes things and how he sees them. We work in the same library and we're in the same department, but what we do is a little bit different. We do the same thing, describing resources, but we do that description differently. So the next example I want to move on to is calendars. So there's quite a few, and I couldn't find a Hunting Snark calendar. I think there might be one, but I didn't have any good pictures. So calendars in this collection can be best described, discovered, and co-located with other calendars in the finding aid. As I mentioned in the previous slide, one of the important things about that edition of Hunting of the Snark is the publisher. It's a unique publisher. It's part of a unique set of these miniature books that can be read in bed with only one hand. And that's something that's fairly unique about why we have it and why it's in the collection. In the case of calendars, I think it's relatively rare that we would, for instance, want to draw out something special about the publication of the calendar. It's more of a content of the calendars and the context in which we have those calendars that brings them together. And I think that's the kind of discussion, as I mentioned earlier, that Bo and I would have, like, what are we actually cataloging here? Is it the calendar? Is it the pictures in the calendar? Or is it who published or drew the images of the calendar? As I alluded to earlier, there are lots of judgment calls inherent in this process, which I've highlighted on this slide. Bo, Rebecca, and I have made many judgments based on the resource, book, calendar, stuffed animal, playing cards, electronic database, and the context in which that resource exists. Sometimes a resource can be described differently depending on its context. So for instance, a copy of a book that's been heavily annotated by the author might be better described and contextualized by being in an archive and described in a finding aid, as Bo demonstrated earlier, while a modern reprint of that same book is more likely to be on the shelves in the library's book stacks. I'm going to have a reprise of Bo's slide from earlier. So this is catalog records on the left, archival finding aid on the right. Note here that we've actually been somewhat inconsistent. There are some calendars with individual catalog records, but the added context that's provided by the find aid is actually really useful for resource discovery and retrieval. It adds something that we don't get from these catalog records in the same way that the catalog record was really adding something to those Hunting of the Snark additions from earlier. An archival collection is really good at taking these items and presenting them in a broader context. And so, for instance, a researcher can see that within our Cassady Carroll collection, we have several categories of ephemera and realia, among them calendars, bookmarks, greeting cards, playing cards, and puzzles. Within the catalog, we don't really have the benefit of co-location that's granted by the informed title that we saw demonstrated with Hunting of the Snark. There are ways of achieving that, but they're less optimal than the hierarchical structure that we saw with the finding aid. So I'm going to return here to my perennial question. What am I cataloging? Am I cataloging a 2005 wall calendar, or am I cataloging one of many calendars that contains illustrations from Alice, along with other material that uses and reuses illustrations in different contexts, such as playing cards and board games? So I'm going to finish there. Thank you all for your attention. Hopefully we've given you some view of some of the material in this collection, what's described in the catalog. I want to acknowledge, just as I wrap up, that I didn't personally catalog any of the books that I featured in this presentation. My colleague Clara, who I think is on this call as well, did all of that cataloging. So thanks for her and her hard work for doing that. Hopefully we've left enough time for some of your questions. I also want to note, I was just making notes before this presentation, and I didn't know what these illustrations are from. I don't remember which edition of Hunting of the Snark this is, but I thought it was like 35 illustrations that I was choosing from for my 4 slides. It's a really fantastic little book. So thank you very much. I'll end my screen sharing.
Thank you, Josh. I'm not sure, should we hand over to Yoo-Hoo for, I think the social hour is scheduled now, and we can all, people from both of my panels, Michelle and Patty and Josh and Bo and I, can stick around and people can ask us questions during that if they have them.
Yeah, sure. But if there are folks who have questions now that may have to go, feel free to drop them, to raise your hand or speak up or drop them in the chat. I think before Josh goes anywhere, I think the thing we all want to know is Cooper really missing? Like, is Cooper safe?
I don't know. The last I could find was a Crimson article from a couple of years ago, and I think he was actually stolen from the library.
Dieter, I think you were first up.
Yes, I have to go. So I just want to ask 1 or 2 questions and just make 1 or 2 remarks. First, thanks for everyone for these last 2 days. It was an incredible, I joined the society at the beginning of this year, so it was an incredible experience for me, these talks. And for our last few speakers, Rebecca, Michelle, Patty, Bo, and Josh, thank you. I just have 1 question and 1 comment I want to make. My question is for Michelle. Your talk on the Harajuku fashion and Alice's impact on Japanese fashion and popular culture. What I want to ask is, have you visited Harajuku or Japan yourself? And if you did visit it, did you experience any, did you have any Alice experiences there? Did you see people cosplaying as Alice, or did you find any interesting Alice merchandise?
So I have been to Japan and I have been to Harajuku. I have never lived in the area of Tokyo, but I've spent 2 different stints living in Japan. One was while doing teaching in the island of Shikoku, which is to the south. And the other was a year in Kyoto studying Japanese tea, which is how actually Rebecca and I met each other. And so I have been there. I have not seen anyone, because I haven't really lived in Tokyo and been able to do like sort of spend days and days in Harajuku. I don't remember ever seeing anyone personally, like with my own eyes, dressed in a sort of Alice derived way. But I have been to the Royal Princess Alice shop, and I have a small, like I've been following this fashion since approximately 2000, I think is the year that I first learned about it. And I used to religiously buy the magazines. So the first time I lived in Japan, although I didn't live in Tokyo, I bought the Kera magazine, which was sort of the flagship magazine. And I visited the different shops and the locations whenever I was in big cities. So I have sort of like passing interest or passing knowledge, I suppose, but I suppose it remains for me to spot an Alice Lolita in the wild.
But it was an interesting talk. Thank you. And I just want to make a quick comment. When we talked about, I just quickly have to find it, Odia. Just give me a minute, please. Let me just quickly search for it. My comment is on, here it is. My comment is on Patty's presentation on queer Alice in queer presentation of Alice. I want to read a quick extract. It's on Carroll. It's from the Robert Douglas Fairhurst's biography of 2015 called The Story of Alice, Lewis Carroll and the Secret History of Wonderland. It's a brief extract, but Patty's presentation made me think of this. A number of Carroll's contemporaries thought that his sexual interests, however pale and repressed, were more likely to have been focused on other men. And then he quotes from Carroll's scholar Phyllis Greenacre, Carroll's effeminacy was sufficiently obvious that some of his less sympathetic students once wrote a parody of his parodies and signed it Louisa Caroline. Perhaps they were aware that he sent letters to his child friends from their affectionate little fairy friend Sylvie, or perhaps they added up his personal habits and drew even more personal conclusions from them. His preference for violet ink, his clean-shaven face and unfashionably long hair, in an era that equated manliness with hair on the chin rather than on the collar, his fondness for jokes that verged on the camp. And then he quotes the joke that Carroll made. We are positively haunted by 3 women who sell lace. If I was in the habit of dressing in lace from head to foot, I couldn't wish for more frequent opportunities of buying it. And Carroll's remark in May 1864 that Mrs. Little's refusal to allow any of her daughters to accompany him on the river thenceforth was rather superfluous caution. But such examples offer considerably stronger evidence of our own desires than Carroll's, particularly our need to make his sexuality fit into established modern categories, and these cannot be satisfied by anything we know. So my comment is this: Patty's presentation made me think Carroll was not considered very manly for his time. He was bullied at school. He attended school at Rugby, which was known for being sport-dominated. And in one of his handbooks, he wrote his name, Charles Ludwig Dodson, and another student wrote afterwards, is a muff, which is like saying he was a sissy. Or I'm from South Africa, and in Afrikaans, we have the word moffie, M-O-F-F-I-E, which is archaic for a muff or a mitten. But for the past 50 years or so, it has become slang for faggot. So I think Carroll might have been a victim of bullying, even homophobic bullying. And my final remark is an example of Alice being queered. In the early 90s, I think 1993 to 1995, a 1-volume manga was published in Japan called Miyuki-chan in Wonderland. In it, Alice is a teenager called Miyuki, and all the Wonderland characters are scantily clad females. For example, the white rabbit is a Playboy bunny riding a skateboard. And the Queen of Hearts is a dominatrix. She wears thigh-high, high-heeled boots and a coned corset. And this was in 1993. It was just, and what's interesting, she has this blonde curly hair. And this was just after Madonna's Blonde Ambition tour, in which she wore that infamous coned corset. And I think I read somewhere, one of the reasons why Madonna's Blonde Ambition tour was so controversial for its time is because with that tour, she brought queer culture into the mainstream. So maybe the makers of those manga brought that subconsciously into their own presentation. So yeah, I think perhaps maybe queer readings of Alice might have a longer history than we suspect. But thanks once again for your presentations, everyone. And I look forward to future presentations this year.
Thank you very much, Dieter. Patty, I don't know if you would like to respond to that in any way. I just want to give you a chance just in case.
Sure. I mean, I think that, yeah, it gave me more fodder. Like I almost wanted to ask Dieter the page number because I'm kind of in the midst of getting into this. Like I've kind of like cracked the surface, but I'm going to be doing more work with the Cassady to continue cracking at this. But it's, yeah, I've seen a lot of, in the cracking open of that just a little bit, like I've seen a lot of signs of, you know, like potential, like what he was talking about, like being called a muff, or just like things about Carroll that may lend towards transness, you know, but we don't have those words, of course, in 1865. And so, but from the 2022 lens, we could look at it. So it's just it's an interesting question to raise, right? We'll never prove it in one way or another, but it's an interesting question to continue to think about.
Thank you. And thanks again, Dieter, for your conversation throughout the weekend. Sarah, I believe you were next.
Hey, I have a question each for Rebecca and then for Patty. First of all, Rebecca, I really enjoyed your presentation on brooches. And I was just curious, and I might be making an assumption, so please correct me. But it seemed like the examples you were giving were of modern brooches, modern Alice brooches. And I was just curious. I mean, I went into my next room and immediately found this little guy. I was curious whether you've done any research into vintage or historical Alice brooches at all, because there must be hundreds, if not thousands.
No, I haven't, and that would be amazing. I love that one you just showed. I haven't. I hope someone does or someone will do that if it hasn't been done already. Yeah, so I was just talking about like contemporary makers in the last decade, just because I had noticed that's like it's such a scene, yeah. And it's amazing to see like almost every couple of months you see another maker release another Alice collection, and everyone's super excited about it and goes for it. And it's interesting, I guess, to me to see the similarities and differences across all the collections as well. And you know, some of them quite clearly, you know, reflecting specific other like book illustrator styles. Some people going really for their own style in their designs.
Well, it's a fascinating topic. I hope we'll
I think it would be great if someone looked at historical representations as well. I know one of the brooch collectors I spoke to, or you know, messaged on Facebook this week, asking for some information about her collection. I don't know if people saw, because I know I put up a lot of photos, but she had some wooden brooches that are very directly of the Tenniel illustrations, and she said those are a little bit older. Yeah.
Awesome.
The Smithsonian, at least 25 years ago, I've worn it that long.
Lovely.
To meetings. I love it. It's my best piece of jewelry.
Beautiful.
And Patty, I want to also ask you, I want to talk to you more extensively about non-Alice fantasy worlds, but I'll save that for later. I have a really specific Alice question, which is, I was thinking about your Tim Burton example, and you really talked about it in terms of Alice becoming a colonial force, sort of colonial, she goes back to a colonial British existence. But I was curious whether you've examined at all how the stratification of Alice is related to specifically sort of post-World War II American ideals of individualism, because even the Tim Burton film is really talking about a Hollywood ideal of what it is to be a strong woman and that sort of thing. And I feel like that's coming very much from a, maybe not post-World War II, but definitely accelerating greatly after that point sort of thing. I was wondering if you've done anything with that.
I mean, no, definitely. And I think there's, in some of my research, there's an interesting like Adam Gopnik quote where he talks about like Hamlet as the like character that like men always gravitate towards because he like can't make up his mind, and then, or like has so much power and doesn't know what to do with it. And then like Alice as like she knows she's surrounded by idiots, and that's like women identify with that, and like why doesn't anyone else see this? And that's kind of like the gist of his quote. But I think it's interesting thinking about Alice as the kind of like coming out of that kind of 1950s thing. And it's like, okay, what is that strong, independent woman? And who is the model for that? Like, it's an 11-year-old girl. Like, that is also kind of an interesting thing, that like, that's where the inspiration is coming from. Yeah, I don't know. It's continually interesting to me. And I think that's like, she just kind of like gets brought in as kind of like this great child. But then I think that she's really like poking at things about thinking about the child as innocent. Like, I don't necessarily think Alice is innocent in the way that many people would say that the child is. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I think we'll take one more question before we head on into a social hour. So Matt, you get the honor of the last question of the program.
Oh boy. So with the finding aid, I've dealt with many finding aids in the last 5 years, and the best one, of course, is the Rosenbach Elizabeth Fuller, except you can't do a word search on it. You have to go page by page, but at least it's full. My thing with electronic finding aids are, all I want to do sometimes is open every drop down with one click and do a word search. Is that possible on your finding aid?
Yes, actually, the Online Archive of California kind of automatically formats its finding aids that way. So if you like that kind of interface, you should search the Online Archive of California. Archive Space. Yeah, the finding aids that we create in Archive Space, kind of the default display is kind of the collapsed versus expanded interface.
I expanded in one button.
You can expand the collection level description with one button. I don't know about expanding everything in one button. I'm sorry to say.
It drives me nuts. I tell you, it drives me nuts. I must admit. I mean, sometimes you just have to do a word search. I mean, some things you're looking for, and to have to click on and click and search, word search, click, word search, click, word. It drives me nuts. I mean, I've heard
that critique before.
It's the most obvious function, you know, and also, I mean, it's always difficult whether you're going to do things by date or by name. Of course, it's best to have both, and if you have subject in there, it's really great. But yeah.
In this case, I got to leave those decisions to the Cassadys, so I'm happy about that.
Mostly what I'm interested in is, things that Carroll actually wrote, if he signed a book, or if you have a letter or a drawing or something that's, I always, another thing that drives me nuts about go on is so with some sites, you can't even filter out anything that's electronic. Sometimes you just want, if you have a hard copy of something. And I found some libraries, university libraries, where you can't filter out, the electronic stuff, and drives me nuts anyway. I have lots of feelings about it.
You can filter for that at USC Libraries.
I'll forward your critiques to the developer of Archive Space.
Well, you've heard it before, I think.
I have.
Yeah, I've used the it's a light blue site with the all California libraries or something. I have it in my head. That's pretty. It's not bad actually.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I am proud that we made it to the end, but also sad, of course, that we've come to the conclusion. So before I hand it back to Linda, if she would like to make any concluding remarks, I do want to just say thank you to all of my colleagues at USC Libraries for sort of putting so much effort and time and thought and care into this. I'm really proud and happy and grateful to be a part of so many different aspects of this, of bringing all you folks together. It's really a pleasure and a delight whenever we're able to do it, and just to really show the commitment that we have, to the collection and to the world, sort of scholarly and beyond that the material inhabits. So thank you all for allowing us to contribute in that way. So I will stop talking finally over these last 48 hours, and I will hand it over to Linda for any closing remarks before you all continue on into social hours. So Linda, it's all yours.
Thank you, Hugh. Congratulations.
Yeah. I want to thank everybody who's been here for both days, but this was a particularly different format and a great presentation. I really want to thank everybody who participated in it, and I love the questions and answers. I think they've been very helpful, and I've learned a lot. And I think in the end, it was very interesting for me to listen to Bo and Josh, because I haven't heard them talk together. In fact, I haven't met Josh. I know Bo. But I like learning what they learn. They teach me stuff that they find about the books themselves. And so this has been really remarkable and helpful for me. So thank you. Stephanie has been, a great president and a friend in the society all the time. I want to thank her particularly as well. So I hope everybody will move on over to the social hour, and we can continue. So if the speakers are willing, that would be lovely. So thank you, and we'll see you in November.